You're listening to old Western stories, where dust settles slow, guns speak loud, and every tale rides straight into your imagination. Hit that subscribe and saddle up, the ride's just starting. The last light bled slow across Coyote Ridge, laying long bruised shadows over the dry grass and the split rail fence that Annie Mercer swore she'd keep standing as long as her breath held. And she moved through the yard with that kind of quiet purpose only the newly widowed know, lantern in one hand, her husband's old coat around her shoulders, the weight of it more memory than warmth now. The boards of the porch creaking soft under her boots, each groaned like the house itself remembering her husband's step and finding it missing. The ridge wind carried the smell of dust and juniper, and down in the gully the coyotes were already tuning themselves for the night, thin high notes sliding under the dark like a warning. But Annie didn't flinch. She'd lived here 20 years with a man who knew the land's moods, and she'd learned every nail and knot and holler of this place, from the barn loft where he kept his traps to the hollow oak where he'd fashioned a log tunnel that could swallow a man whole if he didn't watch where he stepped. She set the lantern on the porch rail and checked the snare line he'd left behind the barn, his handwriting still pinned to the post, telling her which wire to pull in case of prowlers, though he never imagined she'd be the one pulling it alone. And as she moved, she whispered to him the way people do when grief hasn't finished settling in, telling him the cattle baron's men were edging closer every day, telling him she could feel that man's greed in the wind, telling him she'd hold the line same as he would have. The dusk deepened into a thick blue hush, the kind that makes a woman sharpen her senses instead of soften them, and Annie paused on the porch, listening to the low hum of the wind sliding over the ridge, the tired snort of the old mule in the pen, the crackle of the lantern soot climbing the glass, and beyond it all, something else, a rhythm that didn't belong to the land. She stepped down, boots crunching on hard dirt, and walked toward the far fence where the ridge opened wide, her eyes narrowing as she caught the faint glow of lanterns in the distance, small orange pricks moving slow and crooked along the lower trail like someone trying hard not to be seen. And her heart tightened because she'd heard what the cattle baron sent ahead of trouble. Night riders, men who carried ropes and kerosene and the cruel patience of wolves circling a calf, testing the edges before they struck. She ducked inside the barn where the traps were hung on a wall he'd carved for them, each hook labeled in his neat hand, snare, pit, log fall. And she touched the tools not in fear, but respect, remembering how he taught her to set them, how he'd said a trap was just a question the land asked a man, and the answer was whether he lived to see daylight. And she took down the wire snare and the little tin clapper he rigged to signal movement near the fence line, stuffing them in her coat. As the wind rattled the roof, a dust devil spun across the yard as night settled fully, the horizon swallowing the last scrap of sun, the cold sharpening its teeth. And Annie lit another lantern, hanging it near the barn door like a beacon meant to look welcoming, but hiding the truth of the traps she'd already set in the shadows, every instinct telling her the night riders were drawing in like a slow tightening rope, heavy with menace. She walked the fence line once more, checking where the wire snare lay buried under loose dirt, brushing her hand over the ground the way her husband once brushed her cheek, and she whispered, "I've got it, Caleb. I've got it." Though her voice shook once before she steadied it because grief is a cold companion, And courage isn't the absence of fear, but the walking with it anyway. The ranch fell quiet enough that she could hear her own breath, slow and measured, and she turned back toward the house when she felt the prickle on her neck first, the old frontier sense that says someone's watching, and she froze beneath the broad cottonwood, eyes scanning the ridge line, seeing nothing at first but the black seam where sky met earth, until a shape peeled itself from the darkness. A rider, still as carved stone, up on Coyote Ridge itself, where no friendly soul would sit at dusk, where only trouble perched when it wanted a good look at what it meant to take next. And Annie felt her pulse hammer slow and heavy, the way it did when Caleb told her to breathe steady before pulling a trigger. And though she had no gun in hand now, she felt the old urgency settle into her bones. The rider didn't move, didn't call out, didn't show his face. He just let his horse stand there, silhouette framed by the thin, rising moonlight, watching her with a patience that felt like a cold hand pressed against her back. And Annie realized this wasn't the Baron himself. This was one of his men sent to mark the place, to map her steps, to measure her fear. She didn't give him an ounce of it. She simply lifted her chin, lantern burning steady beside her, the traps hidden and set, the land ready to bite if they dared to come closer. And for a long moment the only sound was the ridge wind dragging through dry grass like a long whisper. Then, as if deciding the message was sent, the rider leaned forward, nudged his horse, and vanished back behind the ridge's spine without a single word, leaving the night colder, sharper, more certain in its threat. Annie stepped back toward the porch, lantern swinging, her breath slow but sure, and she knew the siege had already begun, not with gunfire, not with shouts, but with silence, the kind that means men are taking their positions under cover of dark, the kind that turns a widow into a watchtower. She snuffed the lantern with a pinch of her fingers, letting darkness claim the yard, letting her eyes adjust to the moonlit shapes of the fence, the barn, the traps waiting, patient in the night, and she whispered to herself, "Lines held till dawn." Behind her, a loose shutter creaked in the rising wind. Ahead, somewhere up on the ridge, a horse stamped once, muffled, distant, but close enough to tell her the night riders were settling in for the long work. Trouble had come to Coyote Ridge, and by the time morning touched the far hills, they'd learned the widow was still standing. Evening settled over Coyote Ridge like a tired hand, slow and heavy, pressing the last light down into the seams of the hills. Annie Mercer walked the length of the porch, with a lantern in her fist, and her husband's old coat hanging off her shoulders, the weight of it more memory than wool now. The boards under her boots talked to her, soft groans and familiar pops, and every creak reminded her whose steps were missing. She didn't shy away from the sound. The silence that followed it was worse. Out past the yard, the land ran open all the way to the far rim, sage and rock and dry grass laid out like pages in a book Caleb Mercer had spent his life reading. Annie knew every line of it now. He'd seen to that. He'd walked her along the ridge, shown her where the ground went hollow under a man's weight, where a log could be rigged to roll, where wire could run ankle-high through scrub and end a rustler's night in a hurry. He'd called them precautions. Now they were the only family she had left. She paused by the corner post where his handwriting still clung to a nail, the old label he'd written for himself. Snare wire, north fence. The paper was curled and yellowed, the ink faded, but she touched it with 2 fingers anyway. then moved on. The lantern flamed through a shaky circle across the yard as she crossed to the barn, Mule in the side pen lifting its head to watch her go. The sky above was turning the color of an old bruise, purple and mean, and the first stars had begun to show through. Inside the barn, it smelled of hay, leather, and cold iron. Caleb's traps hung on the far wall, each on its peg, each with his careful scratch of a label burned into the board beneath: snare, fall, pit, log. Annie held the lantern up, letting the light play over them. Her fingers found the thin coil of wire he favored, the spring-loaded jaws, the little tin clappers he'd rigged to rattle when a line was tripped. She took what she needed down without hesitation, the way he'd taught her, and spoke to him like he was still up there in the rafters listening. "They say he's sending men tonight," she murmured. "The Baron, the one from down Mesa. Guess he means to see if a widow's spine is as soft as they say." Her voice was low, steady, not a prayer, a report. The wind slipped under the barn roof and sighed through the slats like something trying to answer. Annie set the lantern on the bench and took a coil of wire to the north fence, where the ridge dropped off sharp into a tumble of rock and scrub. Coyotes yipped far off, tuning themselves for the dark, but their voices sounded small against the weight settling over the land. She knelt, fingers working quick and sure, rigging the wire between two half-buried stones, fastening it to a sapling that trembled under her touch. When the line snapped, that sapling would jerk, and the tin clapper back at the post would sing out. Caleb's idea. Caleb's hands. Her work now. As she pushed the last handful of dirt over the wire, she straightened and looked up at the ridge. Coyote Ridge got its name from the way the rock teeth bit into the sky, crooked and sharp. Tonight, they were just shadows, a black saw blade cut between land and heaven. For a while, there was nothing moving up there but wind. Then, slowly, a single figure peeled itself out of the dark. A horseman sat his mount along the crest, still as a fence post, the thin rise of moon behind him. He didn't speak. He didn't ride down. He just watched. Annie could feel his stare from that distance like cold breath on the back of her neck. The lantern at her feet threw up just enough light to mark her as a lone shape in the yard. She left it burning. Let him see. "That'll be one of his," she whispered. "Counting boards, counting doors." She raised her chin a little and stood there facing the silhouette until her eyes watered from the strain. Whoever it was shifted in the saddle but didn't turn away. The horse stamped once, a dull sound carried thin on the air. A long minute passed that felt like a mile. Then the rider tugged his mount around and slipped back behind the ridge line, gone as quiet as he'd come. Annie let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The night rushed in to fill the space he left. She picked up the lantern and walked the fence line again, checking the other spots Caleb had marked. There was the hollow log laid across a dry wash, its inside carved clean enough to hide a man's boot or snap a horse's leg. There was the rock shelf that held steady until you brushed the wrong stone and sent it rolling, starting a slide that would pile boulders into any soul fool enough to stand below. Not much, maybe, against 10 determined riders, but enough to make them pay for every foot of ground they tried to steal. By the time she came back to the house, night had settled proper. The lantern in the kitchen window glowed soft behind the curtain. She went inside, set the lantern on the table, and poured herself coffee that had been sitting too long on the stove. It was bitter and not quite hot, but she drank it anyway. Her eyes went to the rifle rack out of habit. Two old pieces there. A .22 for rabbits, a single-shot shotgun for snakes. Caleb's good rifle had gone into the ground with him. That had been his choice, one she hadn't argued. She laid a hand on the empty space where it would have hung and felt the hollow there inside herself answer. She took down the shotgun, checked the chamber, then set it. Beside the door, better than bare hands, not by much. The wind picked up, scraping along the eaves. Somewhere out on the ridge, a horse whickered. Another answered. Annie set her cup down, listening. The night had a way of stretching time on the frontier. Minutes felt like hours when you knew men were out there in the dark, with ropes and iron and orders to make your life small enough to move. She pulled a chair to the front window and sat, shotgun across her knees, lantern turned down low so the glass wouldn't throw a bright target into the yard. Through the thin curtain she could see the yard, the barn, the black ribbon of ridge beyond. The traps lay unseen but not unfelt. The land remembered where they were. So did she. She talked then, not to chase away fear, but to keep her purpose sharp. You told me never to give it up, she said quietly, eyes on the dark. Said this ridge don't belong to men who never sweated on it. Said a paper title ain't worth a day's work. Well, they're coming now to test that. Her throat tightened once, grief trying to climb up from where she kept it. She pushed it back down. There'd be time for tears if dawn came. The coyotes fell silent all at once, their song chopped off mid-cry. It was a small thing, but it pressed on her nerves like a thumb on a bruise. The wind shifted, bringing with it the faint, unmistakable scent of tobacco smoke and sweat that wasn't hers. Close, too close. She stood, set the lantern even lower, and moved back out onto the porch, shotgun held easy but ready. The yard looked empty at first glance. Then she heard it, the soft clink of metal on stone, the quick curse hiss through teeth, a sudden whinny cut short. Someone had found her wire. A shout went up from the dark near the north fence, half pain, half surprise. Boots thudded. A horse snorted and danced. For a heartbeat, chaos sparked where she'd set her question in the dirt. They dragged their man out quick. She could hear the grunting, the muttered curses, but not before the tin clapper at the post rattled once, bright and sharp, telling her the line held. They knew now she was ready. She knew where they were. Old bastard trapped the place, a voice called from the ridge, mocking but edged with respect. Looks like the widow learned his tricks. Another voice, closer, meaner. Won't matter by sunup. Annie's grip tightened on the shotgun. She stepped out just enough for her silhouette to show in the doorway. Lantern glow behind her framing her as smaller than she felt. Ridge'll be here by sunup, she said, loud enough to carry. Can't say the same for you. Laughter answered, low and mean. Somewhere out in the dark, a lantern flared to life high in a tree, hung from a branch like some crooked star, throwing a sick orange light over the top strand of her fence. A mark. A message. It turned her land into a stage in their eyes, something they figured they already owned in their minds. She looked at that hanging light, jaw set. You don't hang your colors on my ground and walk away whole, she murmured. To make their own mark, she lifted her lantern from the porch rail and swung it out wide, not to show herself, but to throw light across the yard, casting long, twisted shadows against the barn wall. A figure moved behind the smokehouse, one of theirs, and she let the lantern light turn his shadow big as a giant. He fired at it, gun flash bright, bullet-punching empty wood. She smiled, small and hard. Lanterns can lie when you know how to aim them. "Back off, boys," a voice called. "She's wired the place up like a bad dream. We take it slow." Their horses shifted, hooves grinding in the dirt just beyond her line of sight. No retreat, just recalculation. The kind of patience that meant they'd be there all night, pressing, waiting for a crack. Annie stepped back into the shadow of the doorway, heart thudding but hand steady on the stock. "This land doesn't fall before dawn," she told the dark, each word shaped like iron. "Not while I'm breathing." The hanging lantern in the tree rocked in a sudden gust, light jumping wild. For a moment it lit up the scrub to the east, and in that brief flare she saw brush piled where it hadn't been before, low and dry, stacked against the wind. Someone out there struck flint. A tiny spark glowed, then grew, fingers of flame catching, licking at the brittle branches. The rustlers weren't pulling back. They were setting fire to her ridge. The little blaze took like it had been waiting for its cue, orange tongues reaching up toward the dark, smoke curling low. Hoofbeats started up again, closer now, circling toward the cabin as the firelight began to crawl along the ground, throwing crazy shadows over the traps and fences. The first shot from the ridge came a breath later, snapping into the yard and kicking up dirt at the edge of her steps, close enough to spray her boots. The echo rolled off the rock like a growl. The real fight had come to Coyote Ridge, and it was standing on her doorstep. Annie felt the ridge breathing like a wounded beast beneath her boots, as the last edge of night clung tight to the earth, the cold holding fast for just a few more minutes before dawn pried it loose. And in that narrow hush, she heard the rustlers gathering again, their horses stamping, their muttered curses rolling through the dark like gravel in a pan. Every sound shaped by the hunger to finish what they'd started, and she tightened her grip on the shotgun, though her arms trembled from hours without rest, her breath thin as a fence wire stretched too long. The barn crackled louder behind her, flames chewing through the rafters, kicking sparks into the black sky, and the horses trapped inside screamed and lunged at their stalls, their panic turning her guts raw because she knew she couldn't save everything. She just had to save something that mattered, and right now, that meant stopping the riders coming to take what little she had left. So she steadied herself against the corral post as the first silhouettes burst from the dark in a tight line, a full-force charge down the slope, with their rifles raised and their hollers splitting the stillness like a whip. And she fired once, the recoil jarring her shoulder, the muzzle flash lighting her face as one rider pitched sideways from his saddle, tumbling in a tangle of limbs and dust. But the rest kept coming, faster now, because they could smell the end as clear as smoke, and she ducked behind the trough as the first bullet smacked into the post above her, splintering wood across her cheek. Heat from the barn pressed against her back like a furnace, and the flames leapt higher, throwing mad shadows across the yard, shadows that made the riders flinch and veer. And she used that heartbeat of hesitation to sprint toward the gate, dragging the last of her trip wires into place and looping them around the hinge, her fingers numb, her lungs burning, her whole body moving from pure grit because there was nothing left to fall back on, no one left to help. And just as she cinched the wire tight, a rider barreled straight into the trap, his horse screaming as the line cinched its legs and sent both crashing to the ground, rolling through the dirt as his gun skittered into the dark, and the other shouted in fury, spreading wide to avoid the traps, circling the yard like wolves flushed with blood. Then through the smoke and rising fire she saw him, the Baron atop that pale war horse of his, sitting tall and straight like a man who believed the world owed him its spine, his silvered coat gleaming like coin in the firelight. And in that instant Annie felt something cold settle over her, not fear, not awe, just the sharp clarity that comes when a long road finally shows its end. And he guided his horse forward at a slow, deliberate walk, his men parting for him, their faces lit by flame, streaked with soot and sweat, while the barn howled behind her, the roof beginning to sag as the fire tore through the beams. Annie stepped forward into the open yard, shotgun steady though her muscles quivered, and the Baron smiled, not kindly, not cruelly, just the smile of a man who believes he's already won. And he said her name like it was a note in a ledger, something he'd checked off already, and she stood her ground, boots rooted in the dirt Caleb once tilled, the dirt he bled into, the dirt he tried to give her a life upon. And the Baron tilted his head toward the burning barn, remarking that it looked like she was out of time, out of strength, out of everything. And she told him he was wrong, her voice low but steady, telling him she still had one thing left, and that was the truth. And he laughed then, a sharp, brittle sound, telling her truth didn't matter out here, only land, only power, only survival. But she stepped closer, her face lit by the fire, and told him she knew he killed Caleb, knew he rode out here that night because Caleb refused to sell this ridge, refused to bow to a man who'd bought his title with fear. And the Baron's smile wavered just a fraction, as though something inside him had been touched unexpectedly, and he said she didn't understand. Caleb had pushed too far. Caleb had stood in the way. Caleb had needed to be taught a lesson, and that lesson just went further than he meant. But the words slipped too easily, too smooth, and she realized he wasn't confessing out of guilt, but out of pride, because he thought himself beyond consequence, thought himself the rightful lord of every acre he laid eyes on. The riders murmured behind him, shifting uneasily, some glancing at one another as though hearing more truth than they wished to. And Annie raised the shotgun higher, telling the Baron Caleb didn't die for nothing, that she wasn't going to let his memory be swallowed by the lies of a coward who hid behind hired guns. And the Baron's eyes hardened then, all pretense falling away, and he reached for his pistol with a quick jerk of his arm. But Annie fired first, the blast booming across the yard, knocking the Baron sideways in the saddle, though he somehow stayed mounted, gripping the reins with white knuckles as blood spread across his coat. And the horse reared in terror, spinning, screaming, then bolted straight toward the burning barn in a blind panic. The beast crashed through the smoke, the Baron slipping, swaying, and then the roof gave out with a thunderous groan, a sheet of flame collapsing like the wrath of the earth itself, and horse and rider vanished beneath the burning timbers as sparks soared skyward like stars being ripped loose. Everything went silent but for the crackling ruin, the fire snapping and sighing as though exhausted, and the riders stared, stunned, the shock of their Baron's fall spreading through them like a cold wind, their fury dimming into fear, into doubt, into the sudden knowledge that the ground beneath them had shifted. Annie stood in the center of the yard, smoke swirling around her, her shotgun empty but her posture unbroken. And in that moment she looked less like a widow and more like a sheriff carved from the land itself, stern and unyielding, and the riders began to back away. Their will to fight drained, some turning their horses, some lowering their heads, until finally one broke first, riding off into the fading dark, then another. Then the rest followed in a rough, staggered retreat, leaving the ridge quiet but for the groan of cooling wood and the soft moan of wind rising with the coming dawn. Annie lowered the shotgun at last, her arms trembling as the adrenaline ebbed, and she turned toward the barn, her heart breaking at the sight of its charred skeleton collapsing into itself, knowing she'd lost more than she could count tonight. But as the first line of sun cracked the horizon, gold spilling over the ridge in a slow, warm flood, she felt Caleb's presence settle around her, not as pain, not as longing, but as a quiet strength that rose from the earth beneath her feet. The smoke thinned into pale ghosts drifting upward, and the ridge glowed soft and new as though dawn itself wanted to wash the night clean. She walked to the porch, sat on the top step with her back straight, her breath slow, watching the sun climb higher, knowing the riders would not return, not after what they'd seen, not without the Baron to drive their fear forward, and she whispered that they could try if they wanted, but the ridge had chosen, and she had held it, and she would continue to hold it, because some things were worth the cost, worth the fire, worth the long, lonely nights. And as the wind shifted warm across her face, she felt not hope exactly, but something like it, something steady, something stubborn, something alive. And for the first time since Caleb fell, she let herself breathe fully, deeply, letting the ridge breathe with her as the sun broke fully over Coyote Ridge. You've been riding with old Western stories. If the tale hit your mark, give it a like, drop a comment about your favorite part, and ring that bell so you don't miss the next trail we ride. Don't forget, hit that subscribe so you're always in the saddle, and you'll always be ready when the next story rides in.